Today what we're going to cover on the part 2 of this build series is the crossover assembly, as well as this piano black finish on this front baffle, and how I accomplished it only using spray paints, on what I believe might be one of the best looking speakers I've ever seen. But I also might be a little biased.
Okay, we're finally getting into this. These are the 3D printed crossover boards that CSS provides. They make this super easy. It's basically like paint by the numbers. You can see on the back there's all the A's, B's, things like that. We're just going to be joining them together, and everything is laid out really cleanly and everything has a place to go. What I'm doing now is putting some hot glue down here to hold the capacitors in. It's kind of a double fastener because you can see there's holes there as well, and that's for the zip ties that they include with this kit. You really don't need the hot glue, but it's just something I went with. I guess I was just being a little bit extra here. It's sort of a habit of mine, and sometimes it works well and sometimes it's to my own detriment, because sometimes you can take things a little bit too far, then you just run into more problems because of it. The crossover kit that I'm assembling today is their upgraded crossover kit. It has a lot of nice components in it, but there is a substantial jump in price. I think it's around $400 for this. To myself, it was worth it, but that's going to be up to you. I was putting so much time and effort into these, trying to really make the perfect set of speakers, that I really want to get everything I can out of these. So if that's spending a little bit more on an upgraded crossover, that's the way I'm going to personally go. Okay, I'm sure you guys won't mind this, but let's speed this up a little bit. From here, I'm just going to essentially glue all these in, and then I'm going to start applying zip ties to really fasten them down to the board. And then we're going to jump right into the soldering. And I have some really good tips there for anyone that's new or, possibly experienced in soldering. It's just looking for a little bit of a refresher. And by no means am I a pro, but I think these are a lot of good tips that can get people going on this and can easily accomplish a project like this. This looks nice, doesn't it? And that's one of the advantages of these kits. These 3D printed boards make everything look really nice. It's all labeled and laid out so cleanly. So earlier when I was talking about the whole paint by the numbers thing, this is what I was referencing. You can see all the letters here, the A's, the B's, things like that. And essentially we're just going to be joining them together with a nice physical connection. And I'm emphasizing that physical connection part because you really don't want to rely on a solder joint on something like this. The best way to do this is to essentially get a nice twist on everything, because that physical connection is going to have much less resistance through the joint, rather than if you just were to slightly touch them together and apply a little bit of solder. That's really not the way you want to go on this, just from the resistance standpoint, as well as long term, because these would stand on their own just how tightly I'm twisting them together. The solder is essentially just a bonus at this point. When you're doing this, try to plan things out so that you're not making the back of this too big of a mess. What I'm doing now is applying the jumpers, and this kit comes with everything you need. It does include this wire, but you will have to cut it to the lengths that you need. Twisting it by hand can get you so far, but always have a pair of pliers handy, because when you're joining a whole bunch of these together, it's just a lot easier to get a nice twist, and so you have a nice secure connection here. And just like before, let's bump you guys into the future here with a little bit of fast forward. You can get a good idea of how I'm laying these out, and I'll slow it down at the end. So if you want to see my layout that I used, if you want to reference it on your build, you can use that as well. So that'll do it. I have everything secured the best that I could. You can see everything is a little bit long, and that's okay because I'm actually going to trim these up after I get done soldering the joints on them. Now we get into the fun part. And what I was showing there was that I had a clean tip. You always want to make sure that you clean the tip on these really well when you're soldering these joints. And then you want to tin it, because if you tin it, it's going to help to transfer some of that heat a lot better through this joint. And you'll notice here that I have my soldering iron underneath the joint. What I'm trying to do is heat it up, and then I feed the solder in from the top. That way it's almost like it pulls it through the joint, rather than what you might see some people do when they just try to touch the solder to the tip and just kind of drip it onto there. That never works well. What you really want to do is you want to heat it from the bottom and just let it feed through. You'll see it just almost sucks it right into there, and it's going to give it a really nice connection. Some other considerations on this: when you're heating something from the bottom, do assume that you are transferring a lot of heat down the line. So you don't want to hold something like that on there forever. just hold it as long as you need to, because in some cases you might heat things up on the other end that you don't want to, and you could actually loosen a connection in that way. The other thing, just use a fan. I'm using this little tiny desktop fan extractor. It essentially is just pulling all this smoke away from my face. But it's always a good idea to have good ventilation when you're doing this. Open a window, get a fan going, things like that. Once again, I'm taking a little bit of an unnecessary step here, and I'm just hot gluing some of these wires down so nothing's flopping around essentially. You could also try to tuck these underneath some of your zip ties, but in this case, the hot glue gun was there, so I just grabbed it quick and secured some of these down. This would be a really good time to check everything over, make sure that all the A's are going to the A's, B's to the B's, etc. And once you have that done, you can really install these into the box. And this is when I would suggest doing it, because it's much more difficult to install these after everything is already in place. And just like that, welcome to my nightmare. What we're going to attempt today is a high gloss piano black finish. And we're going to do it with rattle can paint. This isn't necessarily an easy process, especially with rattle can paint. And we're going to use a 1K clear rather than 2K, which tends to be a lot easier to wet sand and polish at the end. So it's going to be a challenge, and it does actually prove to be one. Right now I'm just spraying primer outside in my outside paint lab, I guess. I just didn't want to get overspray inside. I have a little paint booth that I use. Not really a paint booth, more like a tent. But I use that sometimes. But for today, I was just spraying around 3-4 coats of this primer down and then bringing it inside to do a little bit of sanding on. And at this point, you just need to sand this flat, and we're just prepping this to put the base color down. This is a little bit challenging in some ways. You got to be really careful because you don't want to sand into the back into the wood, where we have all that MDF sealed. The things we were trying to accomplish beforehand. We don't want to ruin all that and have to take a step back, reseal it, reprime it, resand it. And to be honest, I definitely had to do that and had to put down another layer of primer. It happens, especially when you get on these corners. You have to just be really delicate with that kind of thing. You can't really put any extra pressure on that because you will easily burn right through that. This gives you a kind of a good idea here, what we're looking for. Nice matte finish. I'm using these sponges here so that it gives me more of a surface to it, a harder surface, so I can really flatten this down. It's a time-consuming process. And if you're going into something like this and you're going to paint it rather than veneer it, this is kind of what you have to expect. You're going to spend a lot of time prepping this paint because the prep is almost everything with this. When you're spraying the paint, that really only takes a couple minutes. That's not a long process at all. It's everything leading up to that point. And any mistakes you make, especially on a gloss finish, especially a black gloss finish, is going to show through. Every scratch, every little divot, everything. It's all going to show. So we're going to get this as flat as possible before we move on to some color. Cutting away from my least favorite part of this whole project, the endless sanding, I found a Rubio Monocoat product that's actually new that really made a big difference to the enclosures. I wasn't quite happy with the amount of sheen that I was getting off of this. It was more of a matte sheen, and I was looking for more of, just a little bit more gloss to it so that it would help to pop some of this, the figure that's in this maple that I'm using here. So this curl, it really pops out, gives it almost like a holographic effect. And this Sheen Plus that I found, it looks like it came out just within the last year, really adds a nice layer of sheen over the top of Rubio Monocoat. I think this is probably what I would go to on all of my Rubio Monocoat finishes, unless I really need something matte. And all you have to do is apply this over the top of one of your regular finish on Rubio Monocoat. Rubio Monocoat isn't the perfect finish, but it's so easy and it's so hard to make a mistake with. You put this stuff on, you can easily touch it up, you can easily add more down the road if you need to. Low VOCs, it's not so harsh like some of these other finishes that we use. The only disadvantage for myself was mainly that sheen. It wasn't quite what I wanted, and this brought it right up to that level that I was looking for. You can see it already. You can see that figure starting to pop through. And essentially all I'm going to do here is I'm using my white Scotch pads and using an orbital to polish it in. Then wipe it off when you're done. And this is much improved. I'm so happy with the finish right here, and I think it's going to go fantastic with the piano black that we're going to have on the front baffle. And now before we cut back to my nightmare and get back to my painting process, give you guys a little bit of a look here and see exactly what I'm talking about. How this just pops so much better than it did with just the standard Rubio monocoat finish. This looks really great. And just like that, we're in the tent, the spray tent. What I'm doing here is using my tack cloth, and I'm getting ready to lay down a base coat. This is a very important process, once again, because any little speck of dust, it's going to show through here. So just try to be really careful. You can get away with a little bit of dust when you're dealing with clear, because you can kind of sand that kind of thing out when you have multiple coats of clear on there. But this, you're going to have this pretty good. I'm just using that piece of cardboard there to kind of protect my little tent behind it. So control some of the overspray essentially. But just look what I'm doing there with the pass, back and forth pass, off and on with the spray, just nice and controlled with a slight overlap over each one. This is kind of what you're looking for, and it's going to take more than one coat. On these little duplicolor cans, I actually ended up using close to 1 can per baffle. On YouTube, we like to show all our wins with some fancy editing. We hide all the stuff that, we might not want everyone to see, but here's a good look. Here I am sanding the base coat, which is not ideal, not really what you want to do, but there were some mistakes in there. I wasn't quite happy with how the paint was laying down. So what I'm doing here is I'm wet sanding. I brought up the grit to a higher grit level, and I'm sanding this down back to, what I'm looking for. Some scratches were showing through that I wasn't expecting. And it's just how this goes. But I just wanted to give you guys a look at this, that, yeah, we all make these mistakes and you just got to keep going. There's always a way around it, with paint. Chances are there's something you can do to fix what's going on. And you'll see there that I did go back into the primer, but not to the bare wood. And that's the important part here. The thing is, you just can't spray clear over, your sanded base coat. When you spray clear, it has to go over just your base. It has to come out of the can into the clear. You can't apply base, sand it, and then go to clear, because all of those scratches are going to show through. And now back to what I was doing before. Really control the paint coming out of the can, overlapping layers, lay it down. It's got to be reasonably thick. If you're too far away, it's going to dry before it hits the surface, and that's going to give you that really grainy feel that we're looking to avoid. So especially once you get into the later coats here, it has to be kind of slow and controlled, and, it has to be applied thick. And you'll see here, this is starting to look a lot better, to the point where, I'm starting to think that this might be okay to clear. And after some inspection, that piece actually was ready to clear. So it's back in here, and this gets cleared the same day. I think I was probably clearing this around 30 minutes after applying that base coat, maybe not even that. You don't want to wait too long when you're doing this kind of thing. It has to be at least within a 24-hour window. You definitely wouldn't want to go beyond that. So I tack clothed it again because we need that to be absolutely perfectly clean. And that's why I'm doing this in my tent as well, to keep any kind of bugs, any dust, anything like that, keep it all down. And I also laid plastic down on the floor. And I'm just trying to keep this as clean as a room as possible without having an actual spray booth. The clear is going to get applied the same way as the base, maybe even a little bit closer to the baffle. I like to apply it pretty thick. Otherwise, like I said, you get some finish problems that just give you more sanding work, which we're definitely looking to avoid here. And as you can see here, it's going to be a little bit shinier, and we're starting to wet sand this back. And I am using a hard-backed 3M pad there, and that's just so that I can really sand this back to a smooth surface. What you see there, all those little dots, things like that, that's got to go. If you're going to do a piano black finish, it has to be a completely dulled over flat look. Any of those little contaminants right there, that orange peel, that's going to show through when you try to polish it. And if you want piano black and you want that mirror look to it, that's all got to go. So you got to be really careful here with your wet sanding, because you can easily sand through this. And if you sand through a clear, guess what? You have to go back to the base coat, then to the clear. You can't go clear over clear, because you're going to see where that transitions from the original clear over to a new clear. It's just not a good look. And that's why this is all pretty tricky. You have to be really careful with this. You sand very lightly. You can see that I'm starting to cut through some of that stuff that we're looking to avoid there. Also where I've laid tape on the edges, and that's because those edges are very easy to burn through, so we're trying to be really careful with it. And I somehow survived the wet standing stage, so I'm moving on to my flex polisher. I'm using just some automotive polishers here. I think I'm using Meguiar's 105 first to kind of give it more of a cut. And that's going to help clean up some of the stuff that I missed when I was just doing the wet sand. And when I was wet sanding, I went up to, I think, a 2500 grit or possibly even 3000. A useful hint there when you guys are wet sanding would be to take your water and actually add a little bit of dish soap to it. It adds a little bit of a lubricant to it, and it helps to prevent some of that burn through I was talking. Anything that helps to slide the sandpaper over the surface a little more smoothly is going to be beneficial for something like this. As you can see there, it's actually starting to look pretty good after just the first bit of polishing, and that's with the 105. We're starting to get a little bit cleaner image, but you can still see some of the scratches coming through. And at the bottom, that's where it hasn't had any polish yet. So it still has a little ways to go. A lot more opportunities for this whole thing to break down, essentially. So I'm not going to show you guys the whole process here, but after this, I did go to 205, which is more of a finishing polish, all-around polish, and used a little more of a light-duty pad, and brought it up to the level that I was looking for. But I'm not going to show you guys the complete finished product yet. I'm going to make you wait till the end. But needless to say, I did accomplish it. We ran into some hiccups along the way, but this was just a good example that you really can pull off this piano black finish with rattle can. Just don't expect it to be easy and expect it to take some time. At this point, I was starting to feel a little bit of relief in the pressure here. The dyeing of the veneer was already done. The front baffles, they were polished. They had the look I wanted. All I have to do is attach them to the enclosure. That's really the only stressful part left of that. So really, it's just a lot of final touches that we have to do. And in this case, we are wiring up the rear terminals, speaker terminals. And they do include connectors for this kind of thing, but I prefer to solder this kind of thing. So I just use a physical connection, twist it on there, and then we're just going to solder it up. And we're just going to use a lot of the same rules that we used earlier on the crossover board. Tin your tip. I use my little arms here just to hold things in place. Heat it from the bottom, then just feed it over the top. And it should just absorb right into that connection. And it should be really secure. This is one way to go about it. And like I said, you could use the connectors that they include too. And that would be more of just, a physical, like crimped style connection. The advantage there would be it'd be a little bit easier to take the whole thing apart if you needed to. If you needed to disconnect the crossover from the terminals or things like that. Because when we get to the actual speakers, I'd use this same connection. So if I'm to take mine apart, I'm going to have to cut these and then resolder them, which isn't a big deal for myself. Now we're just getting to installing these terminals on the back. So get those drilled to the appropriate size. Trim up the veneer. Just be a little bit careful there because you can kind of lift your veneer when you're using a drill bit like that. I'm just cleaning it up a little with a razor blade to get some of that extra off so that the terminal can sit nice and flat on there. Once you have those drilled out, you can put those in, then give your speaker the reach around, and you're going to use one of the nuts. And the nuts you'll be putting that nut in from the inside of the speaker, and that is going to firmly attach these to the actual enclosure. And from here, you'll want to take a wrench, and then I'm just using a socket on the inside. You want to use that wrench on the outside because you don't want these to twist, because if they twist, then it's actually going to possibly damage your veneer. So you want to lock it in there. And this one's kind of fun too. A lot of people were saying that these didn't come with enough foam to do the entire enclosure. And I'm going to show you how I do it, and I had enough foam to cover all of it. I did have to get a little bit creative though and actually use some of the foam that came with the crossover kit. As you can see right now, I'm just snaking the wires through for the rear terminals. Then I'm just going to tighten everything up. There's a couple of lock washers on there, then another nut, and you can tighten these on with using a wrench and a socket that I was doing earlier to attach the rear. Okay, here I am at it with the glue again, and this time I'm doing it to the foam. And this probably isn't even necessary, but it's just one of those things that I like to do, make sure it's not going to go anywhere. But if you cut them to the right dimension, it's going to be a snug fit, and really, you should never have to worry about these moving. One thing about the foam pieces, CSS does specifically say to prioritize the lower woofer cabinet. That's where it's going to make the biggest impact. So you'll see that I start with the rear, Then I go to the sides here and I glued all of these too. Just cut them so it's a really, tight fit in there. Everything should fit nicely. There is plenty to do this. Make sure you get the back, both sides. Then something that some people have a little confusion about is you actually can cover the crossover board too, but you'll see me do that later. I'm not doing that quite yet because I still have to do some wiring. Then the top piece there, I actually took that from the box that the crossover components came in. So that fit really nicely on the top. Then from that same piece, I was able to cut a couple more for the rear around the port. Then there was enough for the two sides on the top as well. So I had complete coverage inside this box, and I don't have any problems there. So I'm not quite sure where some people were missing. They must have just cut the pieces in the wrong order, something like that. I'm not sure. But if you see this, we're good to go. What I'm doing now is measuring that port. I believe it was to 9 inches. I have some glue on there and I'm just throwing some duct tape on so I don't have to wait for the glue to dry. When you install these, one thing to look for is make sure that foam you used is not impacting the port at all. It can't be blocking it because that will affect the sound. If you don't have one of these, I highly suggest checking it out for what I'm about to do here. And it's a self-centering drill bit. Basically that the front part just centers into the hole. Then the bit is perfectly in the center when you're actually drilling. Otherwise, a lot of times you're off a little bit, and then when you go to screw something on, it can pull it left or right, and things just can get a little out of alignment. With this, it's right down the center. It's perfect every time. They're not that expensive. I'll link them below if you guys want to check those out too. But it's something that I use quite a bit on things like this port, for example. From here, all I'm doing is drilling out the rest of these, cleaning it up. I'll secure 2 of them, then I'll go on to the other 2. Just wanted to make sure it's locked in place before I drill out the additional 2. And isn't that finish looking really good on that? That curly maple is really starting to look good here, and I can't wait for these to get done. I always hand tighten everything with a screwdriver at the end. It's much better than using your drill and busting right through it. So there we are, we're starting to get close. Those binding posts are done. The port is in, everything looks good. The foam's in, crossover's in. We're getting close here. Next step, let's attach these front baffles. So adequate amounts of glue is the name of the game here. We just want to get it all along the edge, and we want a pretty complete coverage here. I'm going to use a brush to get it in everywhere I need it to be, but you want there to be enough glue to hold everything down, but you also don't want it to leak out and get all over, your veneered finish, your painted finish on the top. You could usually get that stuff off if it's, pretty fresh glue, things like that, but it's just a pain and you don't want to add anything extra that might give an opportunity to wreck your finish in one way or another. You might miss the glue, something like that, not see it till it's all dried. So just be careful here. I'm just using a paintbrush. I'm just making sure to get it all into the nooks and cracks where this is going to come together so we get a nice seal and everything is held together really firmly. I'm using Type-On 2. That gives me plenty of time to do all this for setup time, things like that. Don't go take a lunch break or anything like that because that's going to take far too long. You do need to keep moving with this stuff. You can get some products that have a little bit of a slower cure time if you need, but in most cases, Type-On 2 should be plenty, and it's a really good glue. It always works well. It's nothing crazy. This is just glue after all. Finally, the pieces are being joined together here, and everything looks great. You could probably, you wouldn't really need anything to push down on this to give the fit you're looking for, but my foam is pushing up a little bit. So I have kind of an intricate way of bracing this down. I'm using a clamp on the bottom, then just a couple of spray caps that fit nicely into the tweeter ring there. Then I'm also going to bring a weight plate in to hold the woofer side down. The foam's pushing all this up a bit, so I just need a little bit of extra pressure here. And this 5 pounds would have been plenty, but like the glue, like everything else I've done on extra steps, I take it a little bit further and add 55 pounds for some reason. I guess maybe I was just looking for a little bit more of a workout here. Like the rear speaker terminals, I'm going to go with the same method here. Like I said, they include the hardware. You could use the crimp-on style, stuff like that. But I'm going to go with the twist and solder method. And the only disadvantage here, like I mentioned earlier, is that if you ever have to take these apart and you want to remove a driver, you're going to have to cut it rather than, just disconnect it. And that's fine for myself. I don't foresee myself taking these apart anytime soon. And if I have to, it's not really a big deal for me to cut these, resolder. Same rules as before, apply the heat behind it, let it all soak in. When it came to soldering up the woofer, I put a towel behind here to brace it a little bit so it had something to lean against. I didn't want to take any chance of scratching this front enclosure because I refuse to do any more sanding or polishing at this point, so we've really got to be careful from here on out. And this is the same as always, just solder these up. And then I did use the connectors on here, or I should say the rubber insulators on here, and put them up there. No use really, it's more of just a cosmetic thing and covers up the solder joints. So the tweeters are really simple to install and not much of a concern, but the woofers, you do got to be a little bit careful here. When you put these in, be careful when you're putting it around that trim. It's a tight fit, especially if it's painted because you've shrunk that trim ring around. So be mindful when you put it in. I would tip it upside down like this before you start putting any hardware in there. In this case, I'm just going to put all the hardware in, but I'm not going to tighten all of them down at this point. I just want to tighten the top and the bottom ones so that then I can flip it over and kind of get it where I want it to be. But I wanted it to be on its back right now to make sure that the woofer was evenly spaced within its slot there. I didn't want it to be off if it was pulling the woofer down, if it was being dragged down basically from being vertical. So now that we have it there, we can tighten everything up and we are going to use the drill, which is always a risk because you can easily slip that drill out and ruin your driver or the painted finish on this baffle. Thankfully, we didn't today. Got that done and moved on to the screwdriver. Tightened everything up flush. That's all you're really looking for. Don't go crazy on the tightness. Like I've said before, you can further damage this because this is just MDF you're going into.
So I guess that's going to do it for the build series on these. What's going to come up next is going to be an actual sound review, but I'm going to need some more time with these. I've literally only listened to them for about an hour so far. Everything so far, really good, but I definitely need some more time. I need to get them inside where I can have them in a better listening condition as well. And where I go beyond this, I'm not quite sure. I might build some custom stands for these that would really match the look on it. I have some spare hardwood maple laying around, so I could dye that black, mix in some metal, maybe some gloss black, have a really clean look that would match these really well. That, or I could even look at the CSS bass modules, the add-ons that kind of turn these into a floor standing speaker. It uses their 10-inch driver. There's all kinds of options really. There's subs, but I think I want to complete the set here, either with stands or the bass modules, something along those lines, but we'll see, and we'll get to that further on. But anyways, these DIY projects are a lot of fun for me. I really enjoy doing these, so I hope you guys do too. Please like, subscribe, comment. Let me know on projects that you're working on or projects that you might do in the future. I'm really interested in hearing it, and it really helps to push this video out to a wider audience. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk soon. Later.